for our last panel of today, I want to first introduce our moderator. You've all had the pleasure of being under her leadership for today and seeing, but Almudena Azcárate Ortega is our research lead for our space security program at UNIDIR, and also doctoral candidate at Georgetown University. So she has the wonderful opportunity of moderating our last panel for today. So I'm going to hand the floor over to her to do so.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction. And welcome back to everyone, to all of you here in the room with us in Geneva, as well as all of you that are joining online. I'm very excited about this last panel, this first day, because I feel like in the previous panel, we've hinted at some things that we'll be discussing during this panel as well. So you've had a sort of sneak preview of the issues that we're going to be discussing now before, and I'm excited to get more in depth into these issues. This third panel of this first day is on multilateral efforts to build space security. What has been done and what is next? As you may know, in recent years, many different mechanisms and processes have been proposed to address space security concerns and to achieve the goals of PAROS, or the prevention of an arms race in outer space. Illustrative examples include the 2023 OEWG established by UNGA Resolution 76231, for those who like the UN document numbers, on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours. Also, the 2019 and 2024 GGEs established by Resolutions 72-250 and 77-250 respectively, on further practical measures on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. The 2024 GGE just finished last month, and we've heard already how it finished. It concluded with a consensus report. And then also the 2013 GGE established by UNGA Resolution 6568 on transparency and competence building measures in outer space activities. This panel, with amazing experts, will analyze these initiatives and consider the impacts of the measures proposed by these initiatives for future steps to achieve space security and prevent an arms race in outer space, particularly as the international community is now preparing to embark on supposedly 2 new OEWG processes, but it could perhaps be 1. We will see about that. So we have 5 wonderful panelists joining us today. 2 of them will be virtual, and 3 of them are here in the room in Geneva with us. So firstly, Bassem Hassam, he is the director of the Department of Disarmament and Peaceful Uses of Nuclear Energy, as well as the chair of the GGE on further practical measures on space security, on further practical measures on PAROS. As I already indicated, this is the GGE that just concluded. Then we also have here in the room Clive Hughes. He is the head of space security and advanced threats of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. We also have Marilyn van Deelen, who is the special envoy for space of the European External Union Service of the European Union. Also, Noelle Risa Castillo, who is also here with us in the far right. She's the Director for Space Policy and International Cooperation for the Philippines Space Agency, and also was an expert to the GGE on further practical measures for PAROS, nominated by the Philippines. I forgot to say, by the way, Clive was also a GGE expert nominated by the UK for the recently concluded GGE. And Sergei Belusko, who is the special coordinator of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation for the international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space, who is also joining us online. So you can see, we have a great panel. We're going to be structuring it into two parts, as we've done with the previous panels. In the first phase of the panel, I will let the panelists give some initial remarks about the topic that we are discussing in this panel, and then we will move on to a moderated Q&A. We will have time for questions from the audience as well, both here in the room and virtually. So I encourage you to use the Q&A function of the Zoom, which you can find at the bottom of your screen if you are joining virtually. And if you're here in the room, please do raise your hand or your placard when we move on to questions from the floor. So first of all, I would like to ask you, Ambassador Hassan, who is joining us online. As I mentioned, Bassem Hassan was the chair of the recently concluded GGE. He did an outstanding job to ensure that we could reach that consensus report. And I think it would be extremely useful if you could, in your remarks, tell us a little bit about the recently concluded GGE, including how that consensus report was achieved. Bassem, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Almudena, and it's a privilege to be on this distinguished panel. First of all, I wish to thank UNIDIR for the invitation and for providing me with this opportunity to share some personal reflections on the GGE process, which was indeed a very unique and tough journey. At the outset, I would like to underscore that, in my view, the success of multilateral efforts aiming at the prevention of an arms race and the elimination of the threat of armed conflict in outer space has truly become a necessary requirement for sustaining international peace and security in today's world. Diplomatic efforts on PAROS have been stalled for more than 4 decades, despite the consensus agreement that this topic represents a priority. Some states continue to be keen to keep open the option of placing weapons in space. Others respond by developing and testing capabilities designed to target space systems. Threats have risen significantly, while multilateral efforts to rectify this dangerous situation and address the legal gaps and gray zones face new challenges. These challenges include the establishment of 2 parallel and somewhat competing processes, as well as the artificial and counterproductive dichotomies between legally versus non-legally binding measures on the one hand, and between focusing on capabilities versus focusing on behaviors on the other. The successful adoption of the consensus report of the GGE last August offers a glimmer of hope that agreements can still be reached. This success was the result of a truly collective effort through the invaluable constructive contributions of each and every member of the group and the dedicated, outstanding work by the support team from UNODA and UNIDIR. It was also the culmination of cumulative efforts, as we largely benefited and learned from previous processes, including those processes that were not able to agree on outcomes. Now, how do we measure the success of the GGE? If I may use something similar to Neil Armstrong's analogy, it could be argued that the report is a small step towards achieving outer space security, but a giant leap for the relevant multilateral efforts. The report outlines the possible scope of future discussions, including highlighting the varying views among states on a few thorny aspects. It also underscores various fundamental commonalities and agreements. I believe it represents a very good foundation for future negotiations. It should not be a surprise that the report contains some nuances and caveats. Nevertheless, it's important to note that most of these caveats naturally apply even if they were not explicitly stated in the report. For example, it goes without saying that the elements contained in the report are without prejudice to national positions or to future negotiations. Moreover, caveats are not new to international treaties and multilateral documents, especially those documents related to disarmament. In my personal opinion, The report represents a significant diplomatic breakthrough in the context of an extremely challenging and polarized geopolitical environment. For the first time in decades, we have a consensus UN document that contains a fairly comprehensive and balanced set of possible elements of a legally binding instrument on PAROS. It portrays a common understanding on the sources of threat and the variety of measures that aim to address them, including important conceptual aspects, such as the applicable guiding principles, the sufficiency of the existing legal framework, and the evolution of the relevant UN efforts, including the relationship between the different approaches towards PAROS. It also refers to a proposed framework on the characterization of objects that could be prohibited in a verifiable manner, with a view to overcome the deadlock regarding a blanket prohibition on the placement of weapons. Moreover, the report contains dedicated sections on important discussions on definitions, verification, the non-use of force, and the non-placement of weapons, as well as international cooperation and institutional aspects, while at the same time reaffirming that all the relevant measures should not in any way hamper the peaceful and legitimate uses of outer space. It also ends with a set of straightforward conclusions and recommendations that we hope will be picked up by future negotiators and the international community in any upcoming process. If there is a political will, this report can chart a realistic and pragmatic path towards future successes, and it highlights topics that may require further elaboration during the negotiations. When it comes to the expectations at the beginning of this process and how the final report compares to them, I have to admit that when I was first approached to consider chairing the GGE, the international circumstances were far less intense and complex than those prevailing at the time when we commenced our work. Multiple negative developments occurred, starting with the disappointing failure of the 2023 OEWG, despite the best efforts of its capable chair, my dear friend Ambassador Helmut Legis. And then came the serious accusations earlier this year on the potential development of nuclear weapons capabilities in orbit in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And therefore, the prospects of a successful outcome were eroding tremendously. In fact, until the very last moment of the final session of the group, most participants, including myself, did not expect that we will be able to agree on such a lengthy and comprehensive report, given the massive differences in positions on several fundamental and controversial issues. Of course, many participants had higher aspirations for stronger formulations on the measures that are urgently needed to prevent the weaponization of outer space and addressing the increasing likelihood of armed conflict extending into outer space or of an armed conflict being initiated in outer space. But the fact that we managed to keep these extremely sensitive topics in the text of the report and then adopt the report in its entirety by consensus is a significant diplomatic victory in and of itself. Turning to the key takeaways, I think one of the important takeaways from this GGE process is that for any diplomatic effort on this complex topic to be successful, it must aim at a balanced and comprehensive outcome that equally addresses the security concerns of all parties and the well-known vectors of threat without discrimination or selectivity. There is a serious risk that parallel or competing efforts will further split and polarize the international community. Failure to develop consolidated and reliable binding rules could lead to contested and fragmented regimes, which could in itself become a source of future conflicts. The contending approaches must eventually converge towards a single set of verifiable binding obligations, which can only be effective if they address all the significant security concerns and threats in a holistic manner. I think I will stop here and I look forward to the Q&A segment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bassem. I think that was a really, really useful summary of the report. And I agree with you with your comment on how the act of reaching consensus in and of itself was a huge success, especially considering the expectations of many going into these negotiations, considering also the geopolitically tense climate of today's world. The fact that the group under your leadership was able to achieve this consensus report is definitely commendable and a great success. And as you said, I think it provides a great foundation for the international community as we now move into further negotiations. I think somebody in an earlier panel mentioned how no one space security measure is going to address all space security concerns. So it's true that obviously the content of the report doesn't please everybody in the same way, and it might not be a perfect document, but it is definitely a great foundation that we can use as we continue to build on how we can best achieve PAROS and how we can best ensure space security for all humankind. So thank you for that. I am going to move on to our next speaker, who is also joining us virtually, Sergei Belusko. I would be very interested to hear your perspective about the GGE, about the report that Bassem just summarized for us. Considering that the Russian Federation was obviously a state that not just voted in favor of the resolution, but also sponsored the resolution to create this GGE. And I would also be very interested to hear your views on how the international community can move forward now that we have this report in the pursuit of PAROS. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Almudena. Hello to everyone. I would like to start by confessing that actually this is my third try to join this conference. I failed to do so in previous years, and I hope that this try would be a successful one. And I would like to apologize for those who have expected to see Konstantin Vorontsov here, who is our guru of PAROS and military space issues. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it, but he asked me to convey his best wishes. He wishes you all the success in your work, and he asked me to deliver these opening remarks on his behalf. And since I'm doing not with the military space, I used to work with Vienna UN Peaceful Outer Space Committee, COPIUS. I hope to bring some fresh air to this Geneva discussion on military space issues, and probably to provide you later on during Q&A session with some fresh thoughts and ideas. I hope so. Let's see how it goes. So without further ado, I would like to deliver the opening remark by Konstantin Vorontsov. So dear colleagues, I'm glad to welcome all participants of the annual UNIDIR Outer Space Security Conference. I would like to express gratitude to the organizers for their efforts, especially for this opportunity to share with you a vision of further steps at the international level for the implementation of the goal of the prevention of an arms race in outer space, PAROS, including the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, the use of force or the threat of use of force against or by means of outer space objects. Russia, as the author of a number of fundamental initiatives on PAROS, invariably contributes to the preservation of the outer space free from weapons of any kind and preventing it from turning into another sphere of tensions or armed confrontation. We consistently advocate the preservation of the outer space for exceptionally peaceful purposes for all states on an equal basis. However, recently, the risk of turning outer space into an area of aggression and war have acquired quite real outlines. The course of a number of countries towards weaponization of space, increasing the force of potential regarding space objects and the use of space for combat operations continues to undermine the international peace and security to destabilize the situation in outer space and to negatively impact the advancing towards the goals of PAROS. In this context, we see the increasing relevance of the initiatives to preserve the outer space for peaceful purposes, to prevent the arms race in outer space, and to launch the corresponding negotiations in the line with the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, as provided for by the decisions of the first special session of the UNGA on disarmament held back in 1978. It is important to understand that without reliable guarantees of the preservation of outer space free of weapons enshrined in an international legally binding agreement on PAROS, there is no prospects for resolving issues related to the peaceful uses of space and ensuring the security and safety of space activities. For these purposes, the Russian Federation and China submitted back to 2008 to the Conference on Disarmament the draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, PPWT, and in 2014, its updated version, taking into account the comments and proposals made by a number of states. We expect that the successful results of the UN Group of Governmental Experts, GGE on PAROS, will give a significant positive impetus to multilateral efforts in space security and accelerate the launch of negotiations on a multilateral legally binding instrument, LBI, to prohibit the placement of weapons in outer space, the use of force or the threat of use of force against or by means of outer space objects. The GGE report, adopted by consensus, is called to serve as a basis for the development of the LBI on PAROS and further efforts in this field. The report actually defines the structure of the future LBI and a list of its potential substantive elements, including specific obligations, prohibitions, and restrictions. As an intermediate step on the way toward the LBI, we continue to consider the TCBMs. They are designed to ensure the predictability of the strategic situation in space. We believe that TCBMs should be used on a voluntary basis at the national level to the extent feasible and practical, in consistency with the interests of the UN member states. At the same time, we'd like to emphasize that TCBMs should be complement, but not substitute, an effective legally binding regime in relation to outer space. The only effective TCBM in order to prevent the placement of weapons in outer space remains an international initiative or political obligation of no first placement of weapons in outer space. This initiative is aimed at maintaining the international peace, ensuring equal and indivisible security for everyone, as well as increasing the predictability and sustainability of states' activities to explore and use outer space for peaceful purposes. Over 30 states have already become participants of the initiative, and this number continues to grow these days. The accession of all states to this initiative would essentially mean the adoption of a global political commitment not to place weapons in space, thereby making pointless the development of space strike weapon systems and anti-satellite defense capabilities. The Russian Federation annually submits to the First Committee of UNGA draft resolutions, no first placement of weapons in outer space, transparency and confidence building measures in outer space activities, and further practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space. We plan to submit the corresponding updated drafts at the 79th session of the UNGA. We urge all states to support these documents and become co-sponsors. We would like to draw attention to a dangerous trend of use by a number of states of commercial space systems for purposes which are different from purposes initially declared by putting them into orbit. Therefore, civil space assets become instruments for interfering in the internal affairs of independent states and resolving other geopolitical tasks, thus multiplying risks for the safety of space operations and the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, and provoking negative consequences for numerous social and economic processes down to Earth, directly dependent on space technologies. We insist on the importance of considering the issues of space exploration for peaceful purposes in the Vienna-based UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS, and its subcommittees. At the same time, we do not exclude that understandings and documents approved by COPUOS could be used in discussing the PAROS issues at other UN fora, including in Geneva. Taking into account some ambiguous initiatives in space security, including the so-called concept of responsible behaviors in outer space and the idea of voluntary refrain from destructive, direct ascent, anti-satellite missile testing, we consider it's necessary to concentrate common efforts on the consolidation of discussions on PAROS and on the formulation of the unifying agenda. We expect that an open-ended working group on PAROS established by the UNGA Resolution 78/238 with the task to further study and elaborate recommendations on the possible elements of the corresponding multilateral legally binding instrument, as well as on the other aspects of PAROS, will contribute to consolidation of efforts of the international community in this direction. At the very end, I would like to emphasize that we do not consider the open-ended working group as a library to the parallel open-ended working group on responsible behaviors. On the contrary, we expect to give the OEWG on PAROS most comprehensive and unifying nature in order to achieve effective substantial results and to further advance to negotiations on the international legally binding instrument on PAROS. Thank you for your attention, and I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey, for sharing those views with us. I wanted to highlight from your remarks, you mentioned some things that have also been briefly discussed in previous panels. Well, first of all, how the GGE report seeks to, because it is a consensus report that was adopted, it establishes a baseline essentially to develop an LBA, including both structure and content, and the fact that the experts managed to achieve a consensus on this issue in, as I was saying before, in a time where reaching consensus on things, especially when it comes to disarmament, is not easy. I think it really highlights the willingness of states to continue to talk about security, and the fact that for many states, having a legally binding agreement related to space security is very important. And as you mentioned, Russia and China proposed a draft treaty on this, the PPWT, some years ago, and it's something that, even though the first iteration of that PPWT was proposed in 2008, and 2008 was quite some time ago, it continues to come up precisely, I think, because of how important many states consider this legally binding agreement to be. And I think the fact that we have a consensus report where states seek to achieve that end goal highlights this. But this is, of course, as you also highlighted, compatible with TCBMs. You mentioned TCBMs, or non-legally binding measures, are not a substitute. And I believe Jessica Tock in the previous panel indicated that they are not necessarily a prerequisite for a legally binding agreement either. But they are complementary mechanisms that can be worked on and can be thought about at the same time. You talked about that no first placement initiative. You also mentioned very briefly the direct ascent ASAT, the commitment not to test direct ascent ASATs, which is another proposal of a non-legally binding commitment that several states have also signed on to. And with that, I wanted to turn to you, Marilyn, to provide us with the EU perspective. The EU obviously was not a part of the GGE, but it was part of the OEWG. And I would imagine that you are keen to be part of the upcoming OEWG or OEWGs that we will be having in the next few months. So I'd be very keen to hear your perspective on what is the EU's take on multilateral discussions on space security, including how the EU's regional policies can support these multilateral processes. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Almudena, and thank you to UNIDIR for inviting me to this conference. It's my very first, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm really enjoying the discussions and learning a lot. And second, let me congratulate Bassem as chair of the GGE, but also all the members of the GGE for achieving a consensus report. Indeed, that was quite an achievement, and shows how with constructive approach we can achieve something as international community. And this report should be able to feed into all future processes on PAROS, both the behavior-based and capability-based, as well as the capability-based approach. I think the report recognizes the usefulness to view PAROS as a dynamic endeavor to make outer space a secure and stable place for all states. And it also helps viewing space security as a potential set of complementary measures, which you already mentioned, including both treaties and non-legally binding instruments. So happy to see all those elements in that report. To say a few words of where we as EU come from, we really see a big task for the international community to come together to further develop the international framework on space. It's very much needed. We see the dependencies on space are increasing, and we see the threats in space are increasing, and that is not a good combination. So we need to act. Our predecessors in the 60s and 70s negotiated international treaties, setting out the principles to protect space as a heritage for all humankind. But this initial boost has faded away, unfortunately. We see the last UN treaty, which was the Moon Agreement, still remains unratified. But what it did achieve is setting this cornerstone for us. And the most important one is, of course, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and other related UN treaties, as well as the guiding principles that were developed in the UN framework. Of course, always supplemented with the applicability of international law and international humanitarian law in space. So we have this basis, but I think with PAROS, we have a common goal, a common objective that we see that we do need to develop this further. And the way we see it, this is a broad push where we are pushing different interrelated work forward. Of course, there's already mentioned the very important work on TCBMs, which started quite a while ago and was again reconfirmed in the Disarmament Commission. We have the political commitments, for example, not to conduct destructive direct ascent tests. We have to work on norms of responsible behaviors. And of course, we don't exclude at all future legally binding instruments. And these are efforts that can all move forward together at the same time, as long as they complement each other and reinforce each other. We do have to keep in mind, to be realistic, that historically many legally binding instruments on outer space, but also in other areas, have drawn from previous non-legally binding commitments and principles, or through resolutions in the UN framework. So we see that it's historically political commitments, norms come first, and then come a legally binding instrument. That is historically, I don't say it has to be like that now, but it's a backdrop. And in addition, we see the current geopolitical context. Bassem alluded to that. That's why he didn't think a consensus report was in the cards. That geopolitical context is still with us. So what do we do as EU? We're a very diverse group. but because of that, we realized that we really stand stronger together. And that translates into a natural focus on multilateralism. We really need a collective endeavor with all states on board to find solutions to our challenges. And that then automatically leads to our sense that we need inclusivity in the process. We need all states on board because everyone uses the benefits derived from civil uses of space. You don't need to be a spacefaring nation to do that. But given the fast technological developments and the changes in way space is run with commercial actors, the role of civil society, the important role of the UN, especially UNIDIR, these are stakeholders that we also need to listen to and take their views into account. So that is where we come from as we see process as EU. Another very important point for the EU taking this regional approach is, of course, transparency. We very much want to work with partners across the globe. We have a number of dedicated space dialogues, and including on space security. But we also have huge cooperation through the EU space program, where that does not only provide free and open and full data by Copernicus and Galileo worldwide to everyone that wants it, but also provide for capacity building in order to be able to use that data for agriculture, climate change, emergency services, you name the application. So through that, we try to also foster links with third countries to work together to safeguard this great asset that we have worldwide of getting this data from space. And of course, we also partner with UNIDIR and with the UN in general. That is a part of transparency, is working with partners. Another transparency measure on our side is that we have published our strategy for space security and defense that was released last year. We think it's important that countries or groups of countries, states, how they feel about threats and how they intend to mitigate them. So also as to avoid any misperceptions or misunderstandings on the other side. And we hope many will publish their strategies. And I know that UNIDIR on the website, you have a lot of information on that, but that can always be expanded. And the third element of promoting transparency is the work that we do on encouraging all states to subscribe to the Hague Code of Conduct, which wasn't designed for space, but has some very interesting confidence building measures related to space, especially the pre-launch notifications. So that's a bit for the practical work. I think we've, as EU, been really trying to provide contributions to the calls from the Secretary General of the UN in preparation for the open-ended working group on CBMs, GGE on further practical measures on PAROS, and the open-ended working group on responsible behaviours last year. So you will all have seen our contributions. And we've also contributed actively to the open-ended working groups and to the GGE. We try to contribute intellectually to those, but also to take an active role because it's something that concerns all of us. And then the final point that I think that the EU has helped put on the table is with the very important voluntary commitment not to conduct destructive direct descent anti-satellite tests. I think this is really a very clear example on how we can move forward in the absence of a legally binding instrument on agreement on the broad range of issues that we need to address, but to already get on with it in a practical sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I was taking notes all throughout, but I think you touched on several key issues that were also mentioned in some of the previous panels. For example, I believe it was Julia Selman in the previous panel who talked about how you don't need to be a spacefaring nation to care about space. Everybody uses space, and space is such a connector of people, of countries, of regions, and you highlighted really well with your example of the European Union's Galileo, in the GG we had obviously just state-nominated experts, but in the OEWGs these are open groups where not just states or experts nominated by states, but also civil society representatives from industry can participate, and they can, as you mentioned, bring a breath of fresh air to the conversation. They can bring know-how that states maybe don't have all at the same level or degree. So discussions at the GGE and at the OEWG are different. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but that the OEWG or OEWGs that are coming up are going to be offering opportunities to address these topics that we've addressed in the past in a new way if we involve these non-state actors. And one point also that you mentioned is that legally binding agreements have often come from non-legally binding proposals or resolutions, and the Outer Space Treaty is actually one of those examples. It came from 2 UNGA resolutions. So that complementarity aspect is very important. And on that note, I'd like to move to our next speaker, Clive. I know that the UK has talked about this aspect of complementarity quite a bit in recent years since it proposed its responsible behaviours approach. So I would be very keen to hear a bit of an overview of what this responsible behaviours approach means, what it entails. Maybe if you want to talk a little bit about the past OEWG and the next steps for the international community. Now that we have consensus reports of the GGE, you were part of that negotiation. How do you see moving on to the next chapter, and how do you think that the international community can ensure that compatibility of different approaches?
Thank you, Almudena, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here and pleased to see so many people in the room. It's great to see this, a lot of interest in this topic. Thank you to UNIDIR for inviting me to speak and for organising this conference. The UK is pleased to be one of the supporters of this conference, as we were last year. We consider it a topic that's really important internationally, and so hopefully we will continue to engage in this issue in a major way. Thank you for also acknowledging that I was one of the experts on the group of governmental experts. So let me also take this opportunity to congratulate Bassem for overseeing a successful consensus conclusion to that process. And it was a sort of tough negotiation. And I'd also like to pay tribute to all the other experts who formed part of that group, and I think there's several in the room here, so it's good to see them. And there's a large body of work that underpins that report, which is all there on the website, so it's all worth reading if you have the time and interest if you'd like to do that. I just also want to mention that I was also the chief negotiator in the latter part of the negotiations on the long-term sustainability guidelines in Vienna at COPUS, and so that's 2 consensus outcomes I'm now associated with, and I don't want to claim any credit at all for that. I'm just saying. Right. Yeah. So perhaps what I'm going to, I'll focus on the Responsible Space Behaviours Initiative as you asked, Almudena. I apologise if there's going to be any repetition in what I said and what others have said, but I think that's just inevitable in a conference like this. But basically, I would like to cover developments in the use of space and the associated technologies, briefly touch on geopolitical developments, how the interaction between geopolitics and developments in the use and space technologies influence threat perceptions and lead to these risks of conflict and so on, and therefore how how the norms of a responsible space behaviours approach can help mitigate those threats and risks. So that's what I'm going to cover. So in terms of space use and technology, so obviously humanity has developed a very high dependency on space systems. And this is for a vast array of essential societal and economic functions, as well as providing instruments of national security and defense. And I say humanity specifically and deliberately there because, you know, yes, states have this dependency on space, but you know there are probably 8 billion users of the global positioning system, and so it's something that's really relevant to every individual as well as all countries. And we've seen a really rapid acceleration in the use of space and the development of technology in the last decade or so. And of course, this is delivering very incredible benefits, and hopefully will continue to do so if we do our jobs well here and in other parts of the UN. But of course, this has also deepened our dependency on space systems. So at the same time as these rapid developments we're seeing in space, we've seen an intensification of geopolitical rivalry and an increase in the number of states engaged in such rivalry. States understand that the strength that their rivals have developed through space systems also represent a vulnerability, and hence have developed a range of capabilities that can be used to threaten these systems by disrupting, damaging, or destroying them. And of course, the space technologies that I was just referring to feed into that process because it provides new options in that regard. And so there is a relationship between these two trends, the development in space technologies and the use of space and the geopolitical situation. So developments in the use of space, I guess, are going in a good and positive direction, providing a lot of benefits, notwithstanding a number of the sort of safety and sustainability challenges that we do need to address. And of course, the geopolitical developments are going in the other direction. And I think in this context, there is an increased risk that misperceptions and misunderstandings arise between states in the conduct of their space activities. And these misunderstandings and misperceptions could lead to escalation and, in a worst case scenario, to conflict between states. And so I think the ultimate goal of PAROS is really to maintain international peace and security. This is the fundamental goal that we're all trying to operate to. And I think this is where I hope, or would like to think, the responsible space behaviours can make a contribution. So the responsible space behaviours approach is designed to bring states together to discuss these risks that I've just mentioned and devise ways to reduce those risks. So the idea behind this is that we seek to agree measures to regulate states' space activities in a way that reduces the risks of miscalculation and escalation. And in our view, in the UK's view, these measures can include a mix of non-legally binding and legally binding measures, and that these things can work together in mutually reinforcing ways. So this is why we established the open-ended working group through a resolution of the General Assembly, and which met in 2022 and 2023. And we were overall very pleased with the level of engagement that we got in that open-ended working group. States put forward a wide range of ideas for regulating space behaviours at this meeting. There was a particularly large number of proposals related to avoiding actions that create large amounts of debris. From my analysis, this was one of the biggest concerns amongst those states participating in the process. But there were also other concerns and other ideas put forward. Measures to regulate rendezvous and proximity operations, or measures to address impacts on civilians, and so on. So it in my view, was a very rich discussion, very useful, and was bringing out new topics of discussion and new ideas. We didn't reach any specific conclusions in that open-ended working group, but my impression was there was a significant amount of support amongst participating states for those efforts we were making, and indeed a desire to keep discussions going. So we did submit another resolution to the UN First Committee last year, seeking to establish a second open-ended working group on responsible space behaviours. Over 160 countries voted in support of it. Now, the mandate of that particular resolution proposes that discussions focus on some specific areas, reflecting the main areas of concern highlighted in the original OEWG. So those areas included intentional damage to and destruction of space systems, threats to the safe operation of space objects, rendezvous and proximity operations that could increase the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation, protecting critical space-based services to civilians, as well as services that support humanitarian operations. And then finally, a kind of catch-all, other activities and measures that could reduce the risk of unintended escalation and conflict. So on current plans, this new open-ended working group will commence its work in 2025. And notwithstanding whether this open-ended working group goes forward as is, or whether there's some kind of merger with this open-ended working group and the other one that you mentioned, I nevertheless hope, whatever the outcome, is that we have a good engagement on all these issues and good discussions on all these issues that I have just mentioned, as well as other issues that states may wish to raise. And I think that's the most important thing, is that we have a kind of inclusive discussion where we can all bring our issues to the table, informed by a diverse set of expertise from civil society, from industry, and from other stakeholders with an interest in these issues. And indeed, some of the issues raised by the previous panel, some very interesting ideas and concepts, you know, let's throw those into the mix as well, potentially. So, yeah, so I hope the next step, now that we've had consensus from the GGEs, that we can continue to build on that positive vibe that has been established and try and create a forum for some inclusive, constructive discussions going forward. Thank you. And hopefully, just to conclude, I haven't said any opinion on the GGE. Hopefully I'll get an opportunity to do that in the Q&A, but that's my view on the whole responsible space behaviours idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Clive. I really like how you ended on that positive vibe. I agree. I hope we can keep that going. And while you were talking about the issues that were discussed during this past OEWG and the issues that were proposed in the resolution for this new OEWG on responsible behaviours, you talked about RPOs, you talked about impact on civilians, critical space services, you talked about the issue of definitions and concepts. And I like to highlight that when we look at the text of the consensus GGE reports, we can see a lot of those things also reflected in that report. So I think that highlights that issue of how sometimes you can have different approaches to tackle one same problem, in this case, space security, but the issues or the concerns that states have, irrespective of the how they would prefer to deal or address these issues, are very similar. So in the reports, we also in the GG reports, we can also see a mention to the importance of clarifying certain definitions. We can also see concerns about RPOs and similar activities. So there are a lot of similarities, and so my hope is that as states continue to discuss these issues, they can find that common understanding and they can work in a way that is complementary. Because again, as it was said in, I think it was the first panel today, there might not be just one single holy grail of space security when it comes to solutions for space security. We might need several initiatives which act as building blocks of that one building, which is PAROS and space security. So I would like to move on to Noel. The Philippines has done a great job when it comes to precisely bringing states together, encouraging cross-regional cooperation, and attempting to reach common understanding on these sometimes very difficult and complex issues. So I would love to hear your perspective on, coming from a state that has had such a leading role in these recent space discussions. And as we take our next steps into new space security discussions after the success of the recently concluded GGE, how can we work towards the continuation of that cross-regional dialogue towards reaching common understanding and compatibility of perspectives and initiatives?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Almudena, for that introduction, and good afternoon to all. Thank you for the invitation, and I feel privileged to be part of this distinguished panel with our chair, Bassem, and of course, sitting beside Clive, who seems to be the lucky charm in the consensus process. You know who to call.
Yeah.
Well, on the perspective of a state that has been actively participated and in both the processes, I would like to share my views on how we can move forward with doing the same. Achieving a common understanding. The recent discussions on space security, particularly in the OEWG, on norms, principles of responsible behavior to reduce threats in space, and the recent GGE to recommend elements of a legally binding instrument to reduce arms race in space, were opportunities for all states, regardless of status, whether an advanced spacefaring nation or an emerging space-capable nation like the Philippines, to come together in an open discussion about issues that confront and threaten our common interests regarding space exploration. These interests are not confined only to political interests, but would also impact interests for the peaceful use of outer space, protection of our space infrastructure and space actors, safety of our citizens and territory, and also economic security, as we see more and more our dependence on space services. They were demonstrations of how the dynamics of space exploration and use has changed over the years. And now we see, as has been mentioned earlier, now we see many state and non-state actors and commercial actors that they are now playing essential roles or crucial roles in space exploration. And we share intertwined goals of space safety, sustainability, and security. The report of the GGE that was approved by 25 members representing different states with diverse interests and capabilities was indeed a milestone, or is indeed a milestone, in the pressing global issue of preventing an arms race in outer space. I would like to join my co-experts members in the room to invite everyone to take a look at the report and read it. It is indeed a wealth of knowledge that are encapsulated there. It is a welcome development considering the previous failed consensus processes. And although the report states multiple times that there was no consensus on all points among the experts in the group, the approved report is a step in the right direction to achieve agreement about the next vital instrument that will contribute to space security. States represented in the GGE have had different levels of development and capability, and the consensus achieved, I'm confident that the consensus achieved in the GGE is also possible to achieve in a larger scale. And as we move forward in the discussion, it is important that we preserve the knowledge, lessons, and consensus gains that we have achieved so far, because it was a result of open good faith discussions and negotiations. The report is a valuable resource to inform future drafting and negotiations for a legally binding instrument. And at the same time, there is value to the discussions during the OEWG, which also informed and contributed to the GGE discussions. It is for the benefit of our shared interest to move forward in both directions, to establish norms and principles of responsible behavior, and at the same time, pursue a legally binding instrument together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Noelle. I completely agree with you that the consensus report is a welcome change. I think that considering that 2 OEWGs had been proposed, even when we still didn't know what the outcome of the GG was going to be, I think that maybe some states and other actors were feeling a bit of fatigue when it came to these groups. And so we had a lot of hope placed in the potential success of this GGE, but as Bassem indicated at the very beginning, I don't think people realistically saw this success coming. So this was definitely a very, very welcome development. And I think it has served to reinvigorate the international community as we now go into the next chapter of negotiations. And I don't know what's going to happen with the upcoming OEWGs. I don't know if they will remain 2 OEWGs or if they will become 1. And in fact, I would love to hear, Clive already hinted at it a little bit, but if any other of our panelists have any clues or any preferences or would like to share what they would like to see happening with these OEWGs, I would be very interested in hearing that as well. We don't have a lot of time left, unfortunately, but we do have some time for questions. I definitely have a lot of questions of my own, and but I'm going to be considerate and not abuse my absolute power as moderator. And I see that Claudio from Brazil has his nameplate up. And before I give you the floor, I also want to remind virtual attendees that if you have questions, please use the Q&A function and let us know what those questions are. But please, Claudio, you have the floor.
Introduce myself. I'm Claudio Medeiros Apoldino from the Mission of Brazil here in Geneva. And I was also a member of the group, so it's a pleasure for me to see colleagues from the GGE here. I just want to build on what our distinguished chair Bassem has said as regards the potential contribution of this GGE report to future discussions on multilateral approaches to PAROS. And to fully agree with what he said as to what the significance of this consensus report can be. And I think that the main achievement of the report is that it offers one thing that has been mentioned by many speakers, which is a holistic and comprehensive approach. It's not segmented. Both approaches are dealt with in substantive elements in an integrated manner, and recognizes the fact that both behaviors and capabilities are important and inherent aspects that need to be dealt with by PAROS. And also, one aspect that hasn't been discussed thus far is the fact that the GGE report makes a reference to both processes that we have ahead of us. Both OEWGs created by resolutions 78/20 and 78/238. This is present in paragraphs 10, 77, and 82 of the report, and this can be easily overlooked by those that have not been a part of these discussions and perhaps not been a part of discussions in the past. But this has been an extremely contentious point in the past, and the GGE managed to make references to both of these processes on an equal footing, and this cannot be overlooked. And this reflects the need and the yearning for a unification of these processes, which I think has been clear since the beginning, since the last year's session of the UN First Committee. And this is why my country, together with Egypt and a number of others, Indonesia, South Africa, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, are working on a possible way to unify those OEWGs, building on this common understanding on the need for a unified approach. This would avoid not only a major burden on member states, but also exponentially for following 2 substantive processes on the same issue at the same time, but also exponentially increase their chances of success. So I just wanted to build on what has been said and do a little bit of a advertisement for this approach that we are favoring. And once again, to express my recognition to our chair, Ambassador Bassem, my dear friend, and to my colleagues from the GGE that I see on the floor. Thank you very much.
For that, Claudio, I am going to allow for more questions. I'm gonna, as Sarah did before me, I'm gonna copy her and I'm gonna collect a few questions before I give the floor to my panelists. I see somebody here up front, one of our youth video competition winners.
JD candidate at the University of Windsor. My question is for the entire panel. Considering states are increasingly reliant on private companies for space capabilities, what is your opinion on space governance initiated or self-directed by commercial actors? In other words, how does or how should multilateral efforts account for commercial actors? Thank you.
Very much for that. I also see that we have some questions online. I'm going to read one of them. The European Union is in the process of coming up with a space law, and to what extent will it address issues relating to space security? And to this, I am going to attach a question of my own. What can states do to implement all of these recommendations that we see come out of these processes, like the recently concluded GGE on PAROS, the GGE on TCBMs from 2013. We sometimes hear that states could improve when it comes to implementation of measures that come from the multilateral fora. So maybe that could be something to attach to this question, like what are states doing, or what can they do individually to contribute to space security? So we have two questions, and one comment that maybe you'd like to build up on. So that question on commercial and private companies, and how would space governance work when it comes from those commercial companies? How can states individually do a job of implementing these measures that come out of multilateral fora? And also, if you have any comments about the upcoming OEWGs that you'd like to share, those are welcome as well. So I'm maybe going to give the floor to our virtual panelists first. I would kindly ask you to keep the responses brief if you are able. So Bassem, I would like to give you the floor first, if that is okay with you.
Thank you very much, Almudena. And first, I have to express my gratitude for the very kind words of a number of participants, yourself, Mariolyn, and my dear friend Claudio, Clive, and Noel. And honestly, I regret that I was not able to join you in person this year, and to say hello to all those friends in the room in person. Turning to the topics, first on the upcoming 2 OEWGs, I think Claudio touched upon the core issues there. First, he mentioned the fact that for the vast majority of member states, they will not be in a position to meaningfully participate in these 2 parallel processes. This is quite confusing, and to be very honest, it's my humble opinion that the chances of success for these 2 competing processes are quite minimal. In my humble opinion, I don't see any impediment why we cannot just merge the mandates of the 2 processes. They are more or less addressing the same threats. And we have a very good foundation now with this report to start putting all the threats on the table and all the suggested measures on the same agenda, and give it a chance, because otherwise I think you would agree with me that it's pointless to keep insisting that we have 2 different approaches, and that each of them has advantages over the other. I think you can expect the kind of outcome. Furthermore, I think there have been very lengthy illustrations that it's impossible to divorce capabilities from behaviors. In any existing disarmament or arms control treaty, you're addressing both in the same manner. And there are various examples that I can list in this regard. And I wish to take this opportunity to thank all fellow experts in this group. And particularly, I think Claudio served as a vice chair. We didn't have a bureau, but I really relied on his capabilities and support to bridge the gaps on a couple of very thorny issues such as the applicability of IHL and matters related to gender. And I really thank him for his efforts in this regard. Turning to the question on the role of the private sector, I think at the end of the day, states are the regulators, and they are ultimately responsible for implementing what is going to be agreed at the international level, be it on the front of security or at the front of safety. So I don't think it's very useful to believe that the increasing role and activities of the private sector and other stakeholders in outer space represents an obstacle or requires a massive drastic change in the manner in which we need to approach outer space security. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Much, Bassem. And before I move on to the next speaker, I want to remind all speakers that if you don't have anything to answer to these questions, that is perfectly okay. Or if you just want to answer one or two of the questions, that is also feasible. So now I'm going to move on to you, Sergey. I wanted to ask you if you have any words that you'd like to share with us about these questions that have been raised.
Yeah, thank you, Almudena, for giving me the floor again. So first and foremost, regarding the two parallel processes, our position is very well known. Of course, we would strongly prefer to move on a double speed toward the LBA on PAROS, and actually we don't have to start from the scratch. We have very important elements in hands. We have the PPWT draft proposed together by Russia and China. We have now very important, successful and consensual outcomes of the GGE on PAROS. And Bassem, congratulations again with this milestone success. We have now a negotiation format or platform provided by the open-ended working group on PAROS established by the General Assembly, so we can proceed in a very fast and productive pace. But of course, it's always better to have one process instead of two parallel processes. So I can assure you that we are ready to come to New York to the first committee in an open-minded mood. We'll see what happens, whether we could manage to build proper balance and to find a proper solution. Let's hope for the best. As for the private sector and other stakeholders, you know, it's rather philosophical debate could be open here on what comes first, an egg or a chicken. Should we first concentrate on regulating the peaceful space activities, which is the huge area actually, or we should start from regulating or negotiating military activities, thus paving the way for the broader range of peaceful activities? The question remains open actually. So as for the existing legal frameworks, including the OST, its Article 6 says that the whole responsibility that states should bear all the international responsibility for the outer space activities, including conducted by the private sector. So as for the, I'm trying to be very fast and effective. As for the implementation of the recommendations on a national level, actually, I believe that all the spacefaring nations do so already, including by implementing the existing long-term sustainability guidelines adopted by the UN Committee on the Peaceful Space Cooperation by COPIUS. Of course, sorry, I have some technical problems. I will stop here for the time's sake. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey. And something that you said really resonated, which is that we already have a strong basis that we can build upon as we move on to negotiate new mechanisms and new measures and have new conversations. We don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to reinvent the wheel as we move on to these OEWGs or this one sole OEWG, whatever it may be. So that in a way is reassuring to know that we can rely on those efforts that have been done by others before us. I now want to move to those of you here in the room. Marilyn, maybe you'd like to go first.
Sure. Just quickly on the two parallel processes. What is key is meaningful participation by all. And we are not convinced that 5 weeks in Geneva is feasible for all. Many will have issues with capacity, being able to fully engage in all these sessions. So we would support the merger. But of course, we need to very carefully look at the balance between the topics to be discussed and making sure that each get addressed on an equal footing. And we'd also very much like to preserve that inclusive debate that we've seen in the open-ended working group. As I said, we believe that the insights from civil society, from the UN, from commercial actors really feeds the debate and helps us move forward. And that is then the little segue into your other question, the other question on commercial actors. They are there, they have a lot of knowledge. We need to understand how they operate. We need to understand that because then we can know then we can understand what is needed in order to regulate as governments. So that is why we need them. But as I think Bassem said, it's still very clear it's the role of the governments to regulate the actions of governments, of the commercial sector. And that is, of course, what the EU space law is about. We're expecting it to come out early in the next year. It's work in process. But this is really an EU internal market piece. It's meant to regulate the EU space sector in areas of safety and sustainability mostly, and probably also some competitiveness of the space sector. You can't do that without touching upon issues of security, but it's not meant for that. Then again, we still have to wait for the text to come out, and then it will be debated and negotiated with member states. So we're not there yet. But hopefully this can really help have a comprehensive set of regulation for at least the industry in the EU member states, so that they know what how they be regulated and how they can move forward in their commercial activities. And you also asked, Almudena, on what states can do to contribute to space security. Yeah, and that really like to promote once again, the voluntary commitments. Those are things that you can do, especially if you don't have capacities for instance, destructive direct descent satellite tests. What's easier than committing to that? But of course, it's even more relevant if one does. And also in general, the intellectual contribution to debate, I think, is just something that every state can do, no matter of its size or its industry. So just to flag those two, but I'm sure there's much more.
Thank you very much for that. And Clive, I know that I promised you that you would be able to talk a little bit about the GG. So if you had something specific about the GG that you wanted to say, you can also say it during your answer to the questions right now.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree with everything Marilyn said on the merger, so I won't repeat that at all. I agree with 100% with that. I think in terms of how does the GGE then play into this idea, I mean, I think there are some positive things that I take away from the GGE. And I can mention a few here. So the report suggests that PAROS needs to be based on a comprehensive understanding of the threats. So that, to my mind, that means we need to look at a wide range of possible threats, and not just the weaponization or the placement of weapons in space, but also how states use capabilities in threatening ways or potentially threatening ways. So that's one useful outcome I feel from the report. Another useful outcome, which you know, maybe shouldn't be in a different world, but it is. The report affirms the applicability of the UN Charter and that compliance with it is essential to achieve the goals of PAROS. Now, it shouldn't be really regarded as a significant achievement, but in the current context, I'm happy that we have that in the report. And related to that point, the report is also clear that any future measures on PAROS need to be consistent with the UN Charter, including its existing obligations on the threat, use, or force. Another positive thing that comes out of this report, from my view, is that it acknowledges the view held by many states that the goals of PAROS can be achieved through a combination of non-legally binding and legally binding measures. And then in the GGE, we discussed a lot the topics of verification and definition. And there are some useful sort of conclusions on this in the report. It emphasized the importance of good definitions and robust verification with respect to legally binding instruments on PAROS. It acknowledges that monitoring the use of dual-use space systems or objects could be achievable even if verifying the nature of them is not. And this is one of the ideas which is important to the responsible space behaviours approach. So that's helpful from my point of view. And then there are a number of PAROS measures. The substantial elements is the term that's used in the report. But basically what we're talking about is possibly future legally binding measures, right? And the report here is clear that experts didn't seek a consensus on those things. But what I would like to note is that there is a list of these possible measures, and a lot of them I would say are aimed at addressing behaviours. And so for me, that's a kind of endorsement, if you like, of the approach that we're trying to sort of push forward. Obviously, in the GGE report, they're sort of couched in the context of a legally binding instrument. But from my point of view, we could do it with a mixture of different instruments. So that's just a selection of the things that I found useful in the report, and others will have their own ideas and their own reflections on the report. But that's my take on it. And just to answer quickly the question on commercial, so I think the question was about how do we take account of commercial actors in our multilateral effort. And I think it's easy to get carried away with the idea that there are these companies running away, doing all these activities that are of concern, that are worrying to us. And I think, you know, it's not the case that commercial actors are operating independently of states or anything like that. The state commercial actors are regulated by international law and by the states under that international law. And indeed, it's absolutely important that these commercial actors, who are absolutely expert in space operations, can help formulate the regulations as we develop them internationally, whether that's in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space or whether it's in a disarmament context in the first committee or the Conference on Disarmament. So there's expertise there to be harnessed, because commercial companies are also potentially victims of hazards and threats that happen in space. So they want, you know, space to be a well-regulated environment where they can continue to operate sustainably into the future and deliver the benefits for their customers and for people more widely. So I think we just have to kind of involve them in our discussions and harness that expertise. And I think that's the best way to move forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And hopefully we will have the chance to involve those commercial actors in the upcoming processes. all process, considering what has been said here, there is hope for a joining of those upcoming OEWGs. Now I'm going to move on to Noel for your reply to those questions that have been posed and for any final thoughts that you might have.
I would just like to reply to the question about commercial actors, and I was thinking of how the question was phrased on what to do with initiatives of self-governance by commercial actors, and perhaps that happens. Well, it may seem to be that they are doing self-governance. Perhaps that happens because the technological advancement is faster than how we can agree on governing those activities. So the answer may be on states, we should act faster so that we can cope with the rapid advancement also on technology. And also for the states, as was mentioned and as provided for in the outer space treaties, liability in outer space eventually falls on the states. So it is also our responsibility to inform our private actors in the state of the issues confronting the industry. They will certainly appreciate it, and they can develop their activities in line with addressing those issues also. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we've gone a little bit over time. I personally don't mind because I thought this was definitely a fascinating panel. But we are reaching the end of this first day. Before I close this panel, I want to give the chance to those panelists who want to. I see that Bassem had raised his hand. So I'm going to give the chance to those panelists who may wish to say a couple of final words to kind of like wrap up, provide the final key ideas that they like to share with the rest of the room. Bassem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just had a very quick reaction to the remark that was raised by my dear friend Mariolyn on the need to ensure the balance if we are going to merge the upcoming two processes. And here I would join Claudio in inviting all colleagues to take a close look at the procedural decision that was proposed by Egypt, Brazil, and the other core co-sponsors of this draft procedural decision. I would argue that we did our utmost best to ensure that balance, to keep it as procedural and balanced as possible. We're only copying the core mandate of the two open-ended working groups. With some goodwill and good intentions, I think we can get there. We hope that during the negotiations on the text of this decision, we don't confront any excessive demands for amendments that would take us back to square one, or try to prioritize one process over the other, or a few topics over the other topics. I think we have a fairly balanced text that can cater for the interests and priorities of everyone. So I truly hope that this will see light. Most probably I will not be in my current position by the time the first committee convenes, but I wish you all success. And finally, I thank you again for the kind invitation. I really benefited a lot from listening to the interventions, and I would like to reiterate that we have a very strong foundation now for future efforts. I hope this will be picked up by future colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bassem, for ending your remarks on such a positive note. Does anybody else have something that they must definitely say before we close the panel? I will take that as a no. If okay, perfect. Well, Bassem, I think those words were a perfect note to end this panel on. Very positive, and I agree with you that we have a solid foundation to continue building PAROS and space security on. I hope that this debate, this panel was useful as we now move on to first committee for those among you who are state representatives and who will be traveling to New York for that first committee. Maybe you can take some of those insights that we have from these wonderful experts to your discussions there. So having said that, it is time to close this panel. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here both in person and virtually. Thank you for taking the time to join us and sharing your insights with us.